the anonymous homeless kid who saved pop music. He uploaded 3 songs to YouTube. No face, no name, no press kit, no manager, just music and a comment section that was about to lose its mind. Think about the last time you discovered an artist and felt like you were in on a secret, like you found something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. That feeling, that electric, almost private thrill of discovery, is rare. That person was Abel Tesfaye, and you know him as the Weeknd. But here's what most people don't know. Before the Grammy Awards, before the Super Bowl halftime show, before Blinding Lights spent more weeks on the Billboard Hot 100 than any song in the chart's 60-year history, this guy was a high school dropout sleeping on other people's couches in Toronto, Canada, with basically nothing to his name except a voice that sounded like it was channeling something supernatural. And the reason he made it was precisely because nobody knew who he was. Today, we're breaking down the full story. How a homeless, anonymous teenager accidentally rewrote the rules of how you break into the music industry, and why his story mirrors another artist's rise in a way that reveals a pattern, a blueprint, actually, for how the digital age has completely destroyed the old gatekeepers of fame. Stay with me because this one gets wild. Before we go anywhere, I need you to understand the world that Abel Tesfaye was born into, because context is everything with this story. Abel was born in Toronto in 1990 to Ethiopian immigrant parents. His dad left when he was young, and he was primarily raised by his mom and his grandmother, who spoke almost no English, which meant that for a big chunk of his childhood, Abel was navigating 2 worlds simultaneously. The Ethiopian world at home, full of culture and language he was slowly losing touch with, and the Canadian world outside, where he was this quiet, introverted kid who didn't quite fit anywhere. By the time he hit high school, Abel was already drifting. He wasn't the class clown. He wasn't the kid getting into fights. He was just invisible. The kind of kid teachers forget about. The kind of kid who sits at the back and stares out the window and is having an entire life inside his head that nobody else can see. He dropped out of Weston Collegiate Institute at 17, not dramatically, not after some big incident. He just stopped going. And when you ask him about it now, he's weirdly calm about it, like it was less of a decision and more of an inevitability. School wasn't where his mind lived. So what do you do when you're 17, you've dropped out of high school in Toronto, and you have no plan? If you're Abel Tesfaye, you start couch surfing. He bounced between friends' apartments, scraped together just enough money to survive, and started spending every available hour obsessing over music. Not making it yet, just absorbing it, listening, studying. Marinating in Michael Jackson and Prince and R. Kelly, and drug haze rap and dark, atmospheric soul music, until it all started to blend together into something that sounded like his own. And here's where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating, because what happens next isn't what any music industry professional would have advised. It isn't what any career coach would have told him to do. It's actually kind of the opposite of everything conventional wisdom says about making it. In late 2010, Abel was 19 years old, working on music with his friend Jeremy Rose, a producer who was crafting these incredibly atmospheric, hazy beats that sounded like the background music to a very expensive nightmare. The two of them had been building something in private, something they were both proud of, but also something that felt genuinely strange, uncommercial, weird. And here's what most people don't realize. Those early recordings weren't supposed to be released the way they were. According to Jeremy Rose, the original plan was more conventional. Find a label, shop the music properly, and do it the right way. But Abel had a different instinct, a gut feeling that I think was equal parts genius and desperation. He took 3 tracks, What You Need, Loft Music, and The Morning, and uploaded them to YouTube. No album art, no press release, no promo campaign. He didn't even put his real name on them. The channel was called simply Weeknd, spelled without the E supposedly because there was already a Canadian band called The Weeknd and he needed a different spelling, but also, and this is the part I love, he said in interviews that the name just felt right. Anonymous. Endless. Like a permanent state of existing outside of normal time. He uploaded those 3 songs and then he just waited. And what happened next was not immediate. I want to be really honest with you about that because too many of these stories get told like it was instant. Like he pressed upload and the next morning he was famous. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and more interesting. The songs started circulating in very specific corners of the internet. Music blogs, niche forums, the kind of places where actual music heads hang out, people who listen to albums front to back, people who could hear that this thing was different. A Toronto blog called October's Very Own, which was run by a then up-and-coming rapper named Drake, posted about The Weeknd. And that was like throwing a lit match into a room full of dry paper. Drake's audience was already passionate and Toronto loyal. When they heard these tracks, these dark, sensual, borderline disturbing tracks, they went insane. The comment sections started blowing up. People were tagging their friends, sharing links, arguing about who this could possibly be. And the mystery was the whole point. Because here's what Abel understood, maybe consciously, maybe not, that the mystery made people lean in. When you don't know what someone looks like, when you can't Google them and find their high school photos and their old tweets, all you have is the music. The music has to do all the work. And when the music is good enough to carry that weight, when it's genuinely interesting enough that people keep coming back just to listen again and try to figure it out, you've created something that no marketing budget can manufacture. You've created genuine curiosity. Think about that for a second in the context of how music was being sold in 2010. This is the post-American Idol era. This is the peak of reality TV turning music into a performance of personality. The way you got famous was by being on a show, or by having a look, or by having the right team behind you who could package you correctly. Image was everything. Management was everything. The machine was everything. And here was this 19-year-old with no machine, no image, no name, just music. Just 3 songs uploaded from what was basically nothing. And the music was so compelling that people went digging. They needed to find out who this was. The first mixtape, Trilogy's first volume, Echoes of Silence, wasn't the start. Let me take you back even further. The first proper project, House of Balloons, dropped in March 2011. Abel released it for free, just put it on the internet, no label, no distribution deal, no PR firm. He offered it as a free download because he understood something very important. He wasn't trying to make money yet. He was trying to make believers. House of Balloons is one of those records that, if you've never heard it, you genuinely owe it to yourself to put it on tonight with headphones. It is dark and beautiful and uncomfortable in the best possible way. It samples Beach House and Susie and the Banshees and constructs this whole world, this Toronto nightlife underworld full of pills and parties and empty mornings, that felt completely specific and completely universal at the same time. The reaction was not, "This is good pop music." The reaction was, "What in the world is this and where did it come from?" Pitchfork, which in 2011 was basically the gatekeeper of credibility in indie music, gave it a Best New Music designation. That was enormous. That kind of cosign, especially for someone with no label backing and no name, was the kind of thing that made the music industry stop scrolling and pay attention. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, and this is the thread that runs through this entire story. Abel didn't just get lucky. The anonymity wasn't just a gimmick. It was a deeply intentional decision rooted in something real. He was shy. He was genuinely, profoundly shy. He's talked about this in interviews. The idea of putting his face on his music, of being a visible, identifiable public figure, terrified him. The music was the version of himself he was comfortable sharing. The rest of him, the face, the name, the biography, he wasn't ready for the world to see. And that shyness, that reluctance, That decision to hide behind the music accidentally created one of the most effective marketing strategies in the history of modern music. Now, I know some of you are already thinking about another artist, because this story has a twin. Not an identical twin, more like a fraternal twin, the kind where you can see the family resemblance even though they look completely different on the surface. I'm talking about Post Malone. Because if you go back to 2015, 5 years after Abel's first YouTube uploads, you find another young man in another city with no plan, no money, and music in his head that nobody had asked to hear. Austin Richard Post was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles with 9 other people. He was sleeping on a couch, or more accurately, in a closet, because even couch space was at a premium in this apartment. He was 19 years old. He dropped out of college after about a month, and he had a guitar, a laptop with FL Studio on it, and the kind of unshakable, almost delusional confidence in his own talent that you can only have when you haven't yet been told enough times that you're wrong. The parallel to Abel's story is almost uncomfortable in how close it runs. Both were teenagers. Both had essentially no stable housing. Both had been cut loose from traditional education. Both were working in creative isolation, in private, making music that didn't fit neatly into any existing box. And both of them chose the internet. Specifically, they chose to bypass every traditional industry structure and just put the music directly in front of people. Post Malone's moment was White Iverson. He recorded it in about 20 minutes. He said in interviews that he was just messing around. He wasn't expecting it to be the song. He put it on SoundCloud in February 2015, and within about 4 days, it had 1 million plays. 4 days, 1 million plays. For a 19-year-old kid recording music in a crowded apartment where he was sleeping in a closet. Now, the difference between Post and Abel is interesting and worth talking about because it illuminates something about what changed in the 5 years between their breakthroughs. Post Malone put his face on his music immediately. His SoundCloud had his name. White Iverson had a video. He wasn't anonymous. He was aggressively present. He was his own best hype man from day one. Abel, on the other hand, used the absence of a face as the draw. Post used the presence of an irresistible personality. 2 completely different approaches. Both worked. And here's why, because in both cases the strategy matched the artist. Abel's music was dark, interior, and almost claustrophobic. It needed mystery. Post's music was instantly joyful and inclusive. It needed him. Without his goofy, self-deprecating, genuinely likable presence, White Iverson might have been an interesting song. With him attached to it, it became a phenomenon. But the deeper parallel, the one that I think is the real lesson, is what both of them understood about the internet that a lot of people in the music industry in 2010 and 2015 still didn't fully grasp. The internet doesn't care about your pedigree. It doesn't care who your manager is or what label you're signed to or whether you went to Berklee School of Music. The internet responds to one thing: genuine resonance. Does this make me feel something? Does this make me want to share it with my friend right now? Does this sound like something I've never heard before? If yes, you have a chance. If not, you're invisible, regardless of how much money someone spent on your rollout. Both Abel and Post Malone created genuine resonance before they created anything else. And that's the foundation everything else was built on. So let's go back to Abel, because his story gets even more interesting after House of Balloons. He didn't stop at one free mixtape. In 2011 alone, he released 3 full mixtapes: House of Balloons in March, Thursday in August, and Echoes of Silence in December. 3 complete, fully realized projects in 9 months, all free, all online, all anonymous in the sense that the mythology was still forming and still deliberately obscured. Think about the work ethic that it represents. This isn't an artist who got lucky with one song. This is an artist who was pouring everything he had into building a world, a complete universe with its own aesthetic, its own emotional vocabulary, its own rules. He wasn't just making songs. He was constructing an identity, piece by piece, out of sound. And the press was starting to notice in a serious way. By the end of 2011, he was on best of lists. Critics were using words like visionary and unlike anything else, which, in music journalism, where hyperbole is basically the default language, still meant something because even the cynical writers were genuinely surprised. Then in 2012, he was signed to Republic Records, and here's where a less self-aware artist might have compromised, where the label might have said, okay, we need to sand down the weird edges, we need to make this more accessible, we need a single that sounds like what's already on the radio. And to some extent, that pressure existed, but Abel pushed back. Or more accurately, he had so much artistic momentum by the time he signed, so much credibility built up in the music press and among real music fans, that the label largely had to work around his vision rather than overwrite it. His major label debut, Kiss Land in 2013, was not a pop record. It was genuinely strange and difficult and divisive. Critics were split. Commercially, it underperformed relative to expectations. And Abel did something that I think reveals a lot about his character. He didn't panic. He didn't pivot. He went back to the studio and started working on the next thing. That next thing was Beauty Behind the Madness in 2015. And this is the album where everything changed. Now, some people look at Beauty Behind the Madness as a sellout move, as Abel trading in his darkness for pop radio accessibility. And I understand that criticism, but I also think it fundamentally misreads what happened. Because Abel didn't abandon his aesthetic on that album. He translated it. He found a way to make his darkness legible to a mainstream audience without diluting what made it interesting in the first place. Can't Feel My Face is a perfect example. On the surface, it's a disco-inflected pop song. It sounds like it belongs in a playlist next to something Michael Jackson made in 1983. But the lyrics are about cocaine. The whole song is a euphoric description of drug dependency. The dark content and the euphoric sound are in deliberate, uncomfortable tension, and that tension is the point. That tension is what makes it interesting. The album went to #1. It spawned multiple massive singles. It won 2 Grammy Awards, and it introduced Abel Tesfaye, now fully a public figure, now with a face and a name and a biography the world could access, to an audience that had absolutely no idea he'd been a mystery just 5 years earlier. And here's the full circle moment that I think is the most powerful part of this entire story. In 2021, The Weeknd performed at the Super Bowl halftime show, one of the biggest stages on Earth. An estimated 96 million people are watching, and he didn't bring any guest artists. No Drake, no Ariana Grande, no strategic feature to boost the spectacle. He performed alone, surrounded by an army of bandaged performers in a show that was, and I'm choosing this word deliberately, strange. It was not the typical Super Bowl halftime show. It was dark and disorienting, and visually unlike anything that stage had seen before. It was, in other words, completely consistent with who he had always been. The kid who uploaded 3 songs with no face had become one of the biggest artists in the world on the biggest stage in the world, and he still insisted on being himself. That's not nothing, that's everything. I want to stay on this anonymity angle a little longer because I think we're not done excavating how powerful it actually was, and why it specifically worked in 2010 and 2011 in a way that it might not have worked 10 years earlier. Before the internet, the music industry was built on a simple gatekeeping structure. You made music. You needed a record label to physically manufacture and distribute it. The label needed to recoup their investment, so they needed to sell it to radio programmers and retail stores, and then eventually to consumers. At every step of that chain, someone was making decisions about what was good enough to move forward. And the criteria for good enough were often only partly about the music. They were also about the question, is this artist marketable? Do they photograph well? Can we build a narrative around them that a music magazine will put on its cover? Is their story clean enough to present to mainstream media? Abel Tesfaye, the 19-year-old high school dropout with no connections and a sound that defied easy categorization. He would never have gotten past the first filter in that old system. A label A&R rep hearing those early demos in 2007 or 2008 would probably have said, "Interesting, but what's the story? Who's the audience? How do we sell this?" But by 2010, that old filter was broken. Not completely gone, but cracked wide open. Because now you could upload your music directly to YouTube or SoundCloud or a blog, and if it was good enough, the audience would find it. The algorithm, such as it was in 2010, much more primitive than what we have now, was replacing the gatekeeper. Genuine resonance was replacing industry cosigns. And Abel's anonymity was perfectly calibrated for this new system. Because in a world where music discovery was increasingly happening through sharing, through "you have to hear this" text messages and forum posts and blog write-ups, mystery is a sharing accelerator. When you share a song with your friend and you can say, "Nobody knows who this is," you're not just sharing music. You're sharing an experience. You're inviting your friend into a mystery that you're both going to solve together. That's addictive. That's the kind of thing that turns a listener into an evangelist. Compare that to how a traditional label would have broken an artist in 2010. Lots of money were spent on radio play, on physical retail placement, and on PR firms sending press releases to magazines. That gets you awareness. It doesn't get you the kind of passionate, devoted, almost protective fan base that Abel was building organically. His early fans didn't just like his music. They felt like they discovered it. And the psychology of discovery is completely different from the psychology of being marketed to. When you discover something, it becomes yours. You feel ownership over it. You want to protect it, champion it, share it, but only with people who are worthy of it, who will appreciate it the right way. The Weeknd's early fan base had that relationship with his music, and it created a foundation of loyalty that no amount of radio play could have manufactured. There's also something worth saying about what anonymity did for the music itself. When people didn't know who Abel was, when they couldn't map his biography onto the lyrics and say, "Oh, this is just him processing his breakup with so-and-so," they had to engage with the work on its own terms. The music meant what it sounded like it meant. The darkness was just darkness. The longing was just longing. There was no celebrity gossip framework to filter it through. And I think that made the music land harder. It made it more universal, because it wasn't about a specific person's specific situation. It was about a feeling, and the feeling was profoundly, uncomfortably human. Now I want to zoom out for a second, because I've been talking about Abel and Post Malone, and I keep using the word digital catalyst. That specific internet moment that bypasses all the traditional gatekeepers and puts the music directly in front of real human beings. And I want to argue that this isn't just a coincidence of timing. This isn't just, well, YouTube existed, so people used YouTube. This is a structural shift in how artistic breakthroughs happen, and it has a pattern that you can actually identify and learn from. Let me walk you through the pattern. Every great digital breakthrough story has what I'd call a friction-free first contact moment. A moment where someone who has never heard of you encounters your music with essentially zero barrier to entry. No ticket to buy, no album to purchase, no decision to make. The music is just there, it's free, and all they have to do is press play. For Abel, that was the free mixtape on a Tumblr link. You clicked, it played, and if it grabbed you in the first 30 seconds, and it did grab people viscerally, because those early recordings have an almost physical quality to them, you were in. You were a fan. The sale was made before you even realized you were being sold to. For Post Malone, it was SoundCloud. Same principle. Zero friction. You see White Iverson because a friend shared it. You click, it plays, and posts voice and energy, and the melodic hook hit you so fast that you don't have time to decide not to like it. You already like it. For Ed Sheeran, and I'm going to bring him in here briefly because his story has the same DNA, It was a video on SBTV, a YouTube channel in the UK that was the platform for grime and UK hip-hop. Eid wasn't a grime artist, but he understood that SBTV was where the passionate music fans were, and he talked his way onto the channel when he was essentially nobody. One SBTV video got him in front of an audience that was primed to discover new music, and the rest followed. Different platforms, different genres, different personalities, same fundamental mechanism. Find the place where passionate music fans are already gathered and willing to discover new artists, get in front of them with no friction, and make the music good enough that they can't help but share it. The genius of all three of these artists is that they didn't try to build an audience from scratch. They found existing audiences and introduced themselves. They went where the people already were. And this is actually a lesson that goes way beyond music. It's a lesson about the nature of creative breakthroughs in the digital age. The question isn't, how do I make people come to me? The question is, where are the people who would love what I make, and how do I get in front of them with as little friction as possible? Abel answered that question by uploading free music to a free platform and letting music blogs, where passionate listeners were already gathering, spread the word. And it worked so completely that within a year, he had the music industry coming to him rather than the other way around. But here's the part of the story that I think gets skipped over in most of these narratives, and it's the part that I think is the most important, the part that makes all of this real rather than just inspirational. Because we've been talking about Abel's rise as if it were a smooth arc from obscure to famous, and strategically, there's a clean logic to it. But emotionally, personally, this was a genuinely hard period of his life, and not in the romantic, struggling artist way that gets glamorized in retrospectives. In the real, grinding, unglamorous way that most people who have experienced genuine instability know isn't romantic at all. Abel has talked about the couchsurfing period with a kind of blunt honesty that I respect. He wasn't doing it because it was cool. He was doing it because he had no other options. He was broke. He had no safety net. His relationship with his mother was strained because she didn't understand why he dropped out, didn't understand what he was chasing, and was rightfully worried about his future in the way that any mother would be. He was also, by his own account, self-medicating through a lot of this period. The music on those early tapes isn't just aesthetically dark, it's reporting. It's a first-person document of a life lived inside a fog of substances and late nights and a pervasive sense of dislocation. When he sings about that world, he's not writing fiction. He's writing a memoir. And here's what I think is worth sitting with. The music that made him famous was made during the worst period of his life. The art came from the darkness, not despite it from it. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you need to suffer to make great art, because I think that's a genuinely dangerous thing to tell people, and it's also not entirely true. But I do think there's something honest to be said about the relationship between authentic experience and authentic art. Those early recordings resonate the way they do because they're real. Because the person making them was genuinely living the life he was singing about. The loneliness is real. The hedonism is real. The sense of being unmoored and beautiful and broken all at once, that's real. And audiences, even when they can't articulate why, can feel the difference between art that comes from real experience and art that's been manufactured to simulate real experience. Post Malone talks about the closet couchsurfing period the same way, with a kind of casual acceptance that's actually more affecting than if he dramatized it. He wasn't miserable, exactly. He was just completely committed to the music at the expense of everything else. And that level of commitment, that willingness to sacrifice comfort and stability for the thing you're making, it shows up in the work. It has to. The sacrifice is not incidental to the story. The sacrifice is the story. So let me bring this all together, because I've been building toward a larger point, and I want to make sure I land it properly. What Abel Tesfaye did in 2010 and 2011 wasn't just launch a music career. He helped redefine what launching a music career could look like. And the reverberations of that redefinition are still being felt today. Before the Weeknd, the dominant model for breaking an R&B artist was still essentially the same model that had existed since the 1980s. You needed a major label. You needed radio airplay. Specifically, you needed urban radio, which was controlled by a relatively small number of program directors who collectively decided what black music sounded like on the mainstream. You needed a look that fit within a set of visual conventions about what R&B artists were supposed to be. You needed, in short, permission from a lot of very powerful people. Abel got none of that permission, or more accurately, he didn't ask for it. He didn't wait for it. He simply created the thing he wanted to create and put it where people could find it, and the people found it, and the people loved it, and eventually even the gatekeepers had to acknowledge what had already happened. And in doing that, he created a blueprint that you can trace directly to how artists break in the 2020s. Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas recorded Ocean Eyes in their bedroom and posted it to SoundCloud when Billie was 13. No label, no management, no machine. Just a song on the internet. Olivia Rodrigo built her fanbase through a Disney show, and TikTok before Driver's License turned her into a phenomenon overnight. Lil Nas X posted Old Town Road on Reddit, and TikTok and Bill Iboard initially wouldn't even classify it correctly because they couldn't figure out what genre box it belonged in. The pattern is the same every time. Authentic creative work, placed where passionate listeners can find it with no friction, creating genuine resonance that spreads organically and eventually forces the industry to pay attention rather than the other way around. Abel didn't invent the internet. He didn't invent SoundCloud or YouTube or music blogs, but he was one of the first artists to use these tools not as a supplement to traditional industry strategy, but as a complete replacement for it. He showed that you could go from nothing, literally sleeping on couches in Toronto with no name recognition and no connections, to the top of the industry without ever asking anyone's permission. That's a revolution. It happened quietly with no face and no name, uploaded in the middle of the night from who knows where. But it was a revolution. And the reason it worked, the reason it still works for every artist who follows a version of this blueprint, comes back to the same thing it always comes back to. The music was extraordinary. All the strategy in the world doesn't save bad music. The internet exposes bad music just as efficiently as it amplifies good music. What saved Abel Tesfaye, what turned a homeless teenager into a global superstar, was the fact that when you pressed play on What You Need, or The Morning, or Hi for This, something happened inside your chest that you couldn't quite explain and couldn't quite shake. Something that made you need to hear it again. Something that made you need to find out who was making this, and where it came from, and whether there was more. That feeling, that specific, irreplaceable feeling of encountering music that seems to reach inside you and rearrange something, that's not manufactured, that's not marketed, that's earned. One note at a time, one honest lyric at a time, one night of sitting alone with headphones and making something true. Let me paint you a picture. February 7th, 2021, Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida. The Super Bowl halftime show, the biggest entertainment stage in America, maybe in the world. Abel Tesfaye walks out onto a stage that's shaped like the Las Vegas Strip. He's wearing a red blazer and a face full of bandages, a visual reference to the plastic surgery culture he'd been critiquing in the After Hours era. He's surrounded by dancers whose faces are also bandaged. The whole thing is strange and slightly unsettling, and completely unlike any halftime show that had come before it. He starts with Starby. The crowd, all 25,000 of them who were allowed in due to COVID protocols, goes insane. He moves through the hills, Can't Feel My Face, I Feel It Coming, Save Your Tears, Earned It, and Blinding Lights. Song after song that tens of millions of people know every single word to. And at some point during that performance, if you were watching, there was probably a moment where your brain did this little skip, where you thought, wait, This person was sleeping on couches in Toronto 11 years ago. This person was too shy to put his face on his music. This person uploaded 3 songs to YouTube with no name and no plan and just hoped. And now 96 million people were watching him on the biggest stage in American culture, and he was still strange, still dark, still refusing to sand down the weird edges, still insisting on being exactly and only himself. There's a moment in one of his old interviews where someone asks him about the early anonymous period, about what it felt like to be making music that people loved without anyone knowing it was him. And he says something that I've thought about a lot. He says it felt like freedom, like the best kind of freedom, because the music could just be music. It didn't have to carry the weight of his face or his name or his story. It could just exist. And then he became famous, and the music had to carry all of that weight. And he had to figure out how to be a person in public, how to let the world see him, when his whole instinct had always been to hide behind the work. That's a genuinely hard transition. And I think the fact that he made it, and made it without losing the essence of what made the music special in the first place, is actually the most impressive thing about his story. Not the #1 albums, not the Grammy Awards, not the Super Bowl. The fact that the kid who was too shy to put his name on his music grew into an artist who could stand in front of 96 million people and still be recognizably, authentically, defiantly himself. That's the real victory, not the fame, the survival of the self inside the flame. So what do we actually take away from all of this? Because I know some of you are watching this as aspiring creators. Maybe you're making music in your bedroom right now. Maybe you're writing something, building something, creating something that feels too vulnerable or too weird or too personal to share with the world. Maybe you've been told it doesn't fit the mold. Maybe you've been told the industry doesn't have room for what you're making. And I want to talk to you directly for a second. Abel Tesfaye was told, by the structure of the entire music industry, that he didn't fit the mold. He was a high school dropout with no connections making music that defied categorization. The old system had no place for him. So he built a new door. He didn't knock on the old doors. He didn't try to squeeze himself into a shape that the industry already recognized. He went around the whole structure entirely and built a direct line between himself and the people who would love his music. And once that line existed, once those people had found him and claimed him as theirs, the industry had no choice but to follow. Now, I'm not going to pretend that talent isn't part of this. It is. You have to be genuinely good. You have to make something that creates that, what is this feeling in people? That part is on you and nobody can give it to you. But here's what I will say. What this story proves, beyond any doubt, is that the gatekeepers don't get the final word anymore. The label executive who would have passed on Abel in 2007 doesn't matter. The radio programmer who would have said, "This is too dark for mainstream audiences," doesn't matter. The industry insider who looked at a faceless YouTube page with no bio and no press release and decided it wasn't worth their time. They were wrong, and the internet made them wrong, and there was nothing they could do about it. The internet gave the final word back to the audience, back to the actual human beings who listen to music late at night with headphones and feel things they can't fully explain. And those people, those real, passionate, feeling humans, they found the Weeknd before anyone in a glass office tower told them to. And they never needed permission to love what they loved. That's the world we live in now. Not a perfect world. The old gatekeepers still exist. They still have power, money still talks, and connections still matter. I'm not naive enough to tell you it's a level playing field. It isn't. But the crack in the door is real. The path that Abel walked is real. And if you have something genuinely worth sharing, the tools to share it are in your pocket right now. Use them. Abel Tesfaye uploaded 3 songs to YouTube with no face and no name because he was too shy to show the world who he was. He was a high school dropout sleeping on couches in Toronto with nothing to his name but a voice and an instinct and an unshakable belief that what he was making was worth making. He wasn't wrong. And the next time someone tells you that you don't fit the mold, I want you to remember that. The mold was made by people who were protecting the world they already controlled. The world outside the mold. The world that exists when you stop asking permission and just make the thing and put it where people can find it. That world belongs to whoever's brave enough to build it. Abel built his world 3 songs at a time, with no name, in the dark. And the dark turned out to be exactly the right place to start. If this video hit you differently, if it made you think about your own creative work, or reminded you of someone's story that deserves to be told, or just made you want to put on House of Balloons for the first time, drop that in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them. And if you're new here, welcome. This is what we do. We find the stories behind the stories, the moments before the moments, the anonymous uploads that changed everything. Subscribe, because next week we're going deeper, and you don't want to miss it.